What if the next giant leap in computing does not come from a smarter AI model, but from a machine so fragile it needs a supercomputer just to stay alive? What if the real breakthrough is not the quantum chip itself, but the moment NVIDIA found a way to wire that chip directly into the GPU empire that already runs modern AI? Before we go deeper, do me a quick favor. Tap like if you love future tech stories, subscribe so you do not miss the next big shift, and share this with one friend who still thinks quantum computing is just science fiction. That title sounds dramatic. NVIDIA just connected quantum chips to GPUs. Nothing will be the same. And when people hear that, their minds usually jump straight to one extreme. Either they think this is the birth of a magical machine that will replace every computer we use today, or they assume it is another flashy headline about a technology that is always 10 years away. The truth is much more interesting than both of those reactions, because NVIDIA did not just show off a random lab experiment. It pushed a new way of thinking about the future of computing. A future where quantum processors do not sit alone in some sealed physics lab, cut off from the real world. A future where they work side by side with GPUs, inside the same larger system, each doing the part they are best at. And if that sounds technical, stay with me, because this story is not really about cables, chips, or acronyms. It is about power, not just electrical power, but strategic power. The power to define the next computing platform before the rest of the world fully understands what is happening. For years, quantum computing has had a strange reputation. It has been treated like the most promising technology that never quite arrives. Every few months, there's a new announcement. More qubits, better stability, another startup, another prediction that the revolution is almost here. But almost here is not here. And that gap between promise and reality has been the whole problem. Quantum computers are real, but they are also not ready to replace classical computers. They are delicate, noisy, hard to control, and painfully difficult to scale. They can do extraordinary things in theory, and in narrow cases they already show real value, but they still depend on a massive amount of classical computing just to function. That last part is what most people miss. A quantum processor is not like a GPU that you can drop into a server and start training a model on. It is more like a brilliant but unstable instrument. It needs constant tuning, measurement, and correction. It needs a support system around it at all times. And that support system has become so demanding that regular computing is starting to hit a wall. This is where NVIDIA enters the story. At GTC and in follow-up announcements, NVIDIA made it clear that it sees the future of quantum not as a replacement for GPUs, but as a partner to them. The company introduced and expanded an architecture called NVQ-Link, built to tightly connect quantum processors and accelerated classical computing. It also exposed that capability through CUDA-Q real-time tools, which means developers and researchers can start building software that treats CPUs, GPUs, and quantum processors as part of one coordinated machine. That sounds simple when you say it fast. It is not. The real breakthrough is not, look, a quantum chip talked to a GPU. The real breakthrough is the kind of talking they are trying to enable. In quantum computing, timing is everything. If a qubit holds a fragile quantum state for only a tiny window of time, then the system controlling it has to make decisions insanely fast. Not eventually. Not after a long software chain. Not after sending data through a slow stack and waiting for a response. It has to happen in real time. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to balance a pencil on your fingertip during an earthquake. You do not get to notice the movement, think about it for a while, and then correct it later. If your reaction comes late, the pencil is already gone. Quantum systems live in that kind of world. Tiny errors happen constantly, and if you cannot detect and respond fast enough, the useful computation disappears. That is why this connection to GPUs matters so much. GPUs are incredibly good at parallel processing. They can handle huge amounts of data at once. They already dominate AI training, simulation, and high-performance computing. NVIDIA's argument is that the same strength that made GPUs essential for AI may also make them essential for useful quantum computing. Not because GPUs become quantum, but because quantum machines need a classical brain beside them that can move at extreme speed. This is where the story becomes bigger than one product. NVIDIA is not saying we built the best quantum computer. It is doing something more subtle and possibly more powerful. It is saying whoever builds the quantum computer will probably need our infrastructure. That is very similar to what happened in AI. NVIDIA did not invent machine learning, but it built the compute layer the AI boom ended up depending on. Now look at quantum through that same lens. There are many competing ways to build a quantum processor. Superconducting qubits, trapped ions, neutral atoms, photonics, silicon spin approaches. Different companies, different physics, different strengths, different limits. The field is fragmented. Nobody has won yet. The hardware race is still open. So what do you do if you are NVIDIA? You do not need to bet your entire future on one quantum hardware design. You build the bridge that all of them may need. And that is exactly why NVQ-Link matters. NVIDIA describes it as an open system architecture for tightly coupling GPU computing with quantum processors. On paper, that means low latency, high throughput, and software hooks that let real-time workloads move between the quantum side and the classical side. In plain English, it means fewer delays, faster feedback, and a better shot at keeping fragile quantum operations under control. The company says NVQ-Link can support up to 400 gigabits per second of GPU-QPU throughput, with less than 4 microseconds of round-trip latency in its reference platform. Those numbers may sound abstract, but in quantum control, they are the difference between an idea that looks good in slides and a system that may actually keep up with the physics. If the classical side reacts too slowly, the quantum side becomes useless. That is the tension at the center of this entire story. And once you understand that tension, the headline stops sounding like hype and starts sounding like strategy. Because NVIDIA is attacking the hardest practical bottleneck in quantum computing, not just building qubits, but controlling them well enough, fast enough, and at enough scale to do something meaningful. This is also why error correction keeps showing up in every serious discussion of quantum computing. People love to talk about qubit counts. Bigger numbers make better headlines. But raw qubit count does not solve the deeper problem. Real quantum machines are noisy. Errors creep in constantly from heat, interference, imperfect control, and the simple fact that quantum information is delicate. If you want reliable, large-scale quantum computing, you need strong quantum error correction. And error correction is brutally expensive. It creates a flood of classical processing work. Measurement data has to be read, interpreted, and turned into decisions almost instantly. That means the path between the quantum hardware and the classical hardware cannot be treated like some slow office network. It has to feel more like a reflex. NVIDIA's technical materials make that point over and over. Real-time calibration, real-time decoding, real-time control. These are not side tasks. They are the hidden labor that makes the dream of useful quantum computing even remotely possible. So when NVIDIA connects quantum processors to GPU systems, it is not adding a fancy accessory. It is trying to supply the missing nervous system. And there is another reason this matters. The world already spent years and billions of dollars building GPU-centered infrastructure for AI and high-performance computing. Data centers, networking stacks, developer tools, software ecosystems, cloud workflows, research teams, and buying habits now orbit around accelerated computing. If quantum computing had to arrive as a totally separate planet, with a totally separate toolchain and a totally separate operations model, adoption would be much slower. But if quantum can plug into the GPU world that already exists, everything changes. Now, quantum is not asking to replace the whole city. It is asking for a district inside the city that is already built. That is a much easier sell, and it is part of why NVIDIA's message is powerful. It turns quantum from an isolated moonshot into an extension of accelerated computing. Let me make this concrete. Back in 2023, NVIDIA and quantum machines introduced DGX Quantum, a system built to couple NVIDIA's Grace Hopper platform with Quantum Machines' control stack. The idea was already clear: bring low-latency classical computing into the heart of quantum control. That system was an early sign of where NVIDIA wanted to go. But what we are seeing now is broader and more ambitious. NVQ-Link is not being framed as a one-off machine. It is being framed as an open architecture. NVIDIA says it was shaped with input from US national labs, quantum processor builders, and controller companies. The ecosystem around it is wide. Multiple QPU builders, multiple controller builders, national research institutions, supercomputing centers. That matters because platform power grows when many players can build on the same layer. If only one lab could use this, it would be interesting. But when NVIDIA starts talking about a framework that can work across many quantum modalities and many control systems, the story shifts from product launch to infrastructure grab. And that is the part many people will underestimate, because infrastructure stories sound boring until they suddenly run the world. If you are getting value from this so far, hit the like button like you are voting early on the future. Subscribe before this story becomes mainstream, and share this video with someone who talks about AI all day but has not yet noticed the quantum layer forming underneath it. Now let's talk about proof. One of the easiest ways to get lost in quantum news is to confuse future vision with current reality. So we need to separate what has been promised from what has actually been demonstrated. One of the most important real-world signals came from Berkeley Lab. In 2026, researchers there described a collaboration with NVIDIA that connected the lab's open-source QBC quantum control stack to an NVIDIA DGX Spark system using NVQ-Link. The goal was simple to say and hard to do: allow the quantum processor and GPU to operate together in real time with low latency and high bandwidth. Why is that important? Because it turns abstract architecture into an actual workflow. According to the lab, quantum data could flow directly toward GPU memory over a high-speed networking link with very little CPU involvement. This reduces delay and makes the feedback loop tighter. In practice, that means the GPU can analyze results quickly and send updated instructions back to the quantum hardware while the experiment is still alive. That is not science fiction. That is a concrete step toward hybrid quantum classical control. And notice the pattern here. The value is not coming from the quantum chip acting alone. The value is coming from the speed of the loop between the quantum chip and the GPU system. That loop is the story. Berkeley researchers also pointed to future uses like readout classification, gate tuning, and real-time error correction decoding using AI models on the GPU side. That is where this starts to become even more interesting, because now we are no longer just talking about classical compute helping quantum. We are talking about AI-enhanced classical compute helping quantum in real time. So let that sink in. The same company that became central to the AI age is positioning its hardware and software to become central in the control layer of the quantum age. And it is doing it by combining those two worlds instead of treating them as separate revolutions. That is a very dangerous kind of advantage for competitors, because if NVIDIA can become the default operating layer between AI supercomputers and quantum processors, it does not need to own every quantum chip. It only needs to own the place where the important work gets coordinated. And that brings us to another key point. This is not just about research labs playing with impressive prototypes. National laboratories and supercomputing centers are involved because the applications at stake are serious. Drug discovery, materials science, chemistry, optimization, complex simulation. These are the kinds of problems people keep coming back to, because they are the places where quantum computing may eventually do things classical systems struggle with. Not everything, not most things, certain things. That distinction matters. One reason quantum stories often lose people is that the discussion becomes too absolute. Some fans act like quantum will replace all classical machines. Some critics act like quantum is useless until it replaces all classical machines. Both views are wrong. The smarter view is that quantum may become a special accelerator for specific classes of problems, while GPUs remain essential for everything around it. Simulation, orchestration, data movement, AI assistance, and error correction. In other words, the future may not be CPU versus GPU versus QPU. It may be CPU plus GPU plus QPU. That is a very different mental model, and once you adopt it, NVIDIA's move makes perfect sense. Instead of waiting for one grand quantum moment when everything changes overnight, NVIDIA is building for the slower but more realistic transition where hybrid systems grow step by step. First in research, then in advanced industry workflows, then in supercomputing centers, then, maybe much later, in broader commercial platforms. This gradual path is far more believable than the old fantasy. The fantasy that one day a quantum computer appears and suddenly flips the whole industry upside down. No, big platform shifts usually arrive in layers. And what NVIDIA has done is lay one of the layers that could matter most. There's also a geopolitical angle here that should not be ignored. When US national labs, European research centers, and Asian supercomputing institutions all start paying attention to the same integration layer, that tells you quantum is no longer just a small academic curiosity. It is entering the strategic computing conversation. NVIDIA has said more than a dozen supercomputing centers around the world are adopting NVQ-link-related approaches to integrate quantum processors. That includes major national research institutions and labs that think in decades, not in social media cycles. These organizations do not move because of buzz alone. They move because they see a bottleneck worth solving. And the bottleneck is this. Quantum hardware may improve, but without a real-time classical system beside it, scaling toward useful computation becomes much harder. That is why even a technical detail like latency becomes politically and economically important. Low latency is not just a performance brag. It is a gatekeeper for whether hybrid quantum systems can mature fast enough to matter. We should also talk about Quantinuum's Helios system because it helps show where this is heading. NVIDIA said Quantinuum's Helios processor used NVQ-link and CUDA-Q to demonstrate real-time decoding for quantum error correction, with a reaction time measured in microseconds and comfortably inside the processor's operating window. This means the classical side was fast enough to help the quantum side react before the computation fell apart. That is the ballgame. If this kind of workflow improves, quantum stops being a fragile physics demo and starts inching closer to becoming an engineered computing system. Still, we have to stay honest. This does not mean your laptop is about to get a quantum upgrade. It does not mean data centers will be filled with large-scale, fault-tolerant quantum racks next year. It does not mean quantum has beaten classical computing in the broad sense. And it definitely does not mean every quantum company is suddenly safe from the brutal realities of hardware development. Quantum is still hard, very hard, Different hardware approaches still face major scaling challenges. Error rates are still a huge problem. Cooling, control, manufacturing, and economics are still real limits. There is still enormous uncertainty about which architectures will prove most practical over time, but none of that weakens NVIDIA's move. In a strange way, it strengthens it. Because the more uncertain the quantum hardware race is, the more valuable a flexible integration layer becomes. If nobody knows which kind of QPU will dominate, then the smartest place to stand may be one layer above the fight, providing the compute fabric, the developer tools, the control paths, and the systems glue that everyone needs. That is where NVIDIA loves to live. It is also why the company's quantum strategy feels less like a gamble and more like a repeatable playbook. In AI, it sold picks and shovels during a gold rush. In quantum, it may be building the roads and power grid before the city is finished. And if that works, the companies that eventually ship great quantum hardware could still find themselves depending on NVIDIA for the surrounding infrastructure. Pause for a second and think about how enormous that would be. The AI boom already made NVIDIA one of the defining infrastructure companies. If the company also becomes a central layer in hybrid quantum computing, then it is not just riding one platform shift, it is sitting at the crossover point between two of them. That is why this story matters beyond quantum enthusiasts. It matters to investors, cloud providers, national labs, enterprise leaders, and anyone watching the future of computation as a strategic contest. Whoever controls the interfaces between computing layers often ends up controlling far more than the headlines reveal. And that brings us to the emotional core of this story. Most technological revolutions do not feel like revolutions at first. They feel like strange engineering decisions that only specialists care about. A new interface, a new stack, a new protocol. Boring right up until the moment it becomes unavoidable. The internet was once a weird technical network. GPUs were once thought of mainly as graphics parts. Cloud computing once sounded like rented servers for geeks. AI once felt like a niche research obsession. Then the infrastructure matured and the world reorganized around it. Quantum could follow a similar path. Not because it becomes universal overnight, but because the support systems around it become good enough for real work. That is what NVIDIA is trying to accelerate. Not just the chip, the surrounding reality. And I think that is why this moment feels bigger than a normal product announcement. If this video is opening your eyes, here's my second request. Subscribe now before this channel gets crowded with people chasing the trend later. Leave a like so more viewers catch this early, and send this video to the one friend who always says, "I will care when quantum is useful." Because this is exactly what useful starts to look like. Now let's go one level deeper. Why does this happen now? Why 2025, 2026, and not 5 years earlier? Part of the answer is that AI changed the economics of compute. The world built giant GPU infrastructure because AI forced it to. That created a rare historical condition. Suddenly, there are more accelerated systems and more willingness to invest in specialized compute than ever before. Quantum can now grow next to that wave instead of trying to build a whole separate ocean. That is a huge advantage. Another part of the answer is that quantum research itself is maturing. The conversation is shifting away from pure wonder and toward engineering discipline. People are asking harder questions now. Not, can you make a qubit? But can you control thousands of them? Not, can you show a quantum effect? But can you keep a useful computation alive? Not, can you publish a breakthrough? But can you build a system? Those are infrastructure questions. And infrastructure questions are where NVIDIA is strongest. Even the language NVIDIA uses reveals this shift. It talks about orchestration, control, calibration, and interoperability. That is not the language of a science fair demo. That is the language of a platform company trying to make an emerging field operational. And platform companies can shape industries long before those industries look mature to the public. There's another subtle point here that matters a lot. NVQLink is described as an open architecture. Open does not always mean free, but it does mean NVIDIA understands that quantum is too diverse to lock into one narrow stack too early. If the company wants to sit at the center of the ecosystem, it has to be compatible with many QPU types and research teams. That flexibility is strategic. It says, bring your quantum hardware. We will help it speak accelerated computing. And in a fragmented market, the company that makes everyone interoperable can become the company nobody can ignore. Now I want to address one possible objection. Some people will hear all of this and say, why assume this changes everything? Fair question. The answer is not that everything changes tomorrow morning. The answer is that a key constraint may be starting to loosen. For a long time, quantum computing has been trapped in a loop. The hardware is fragile, so you need better control. Better control requires more real-time classical processing. But if the classical processing path is too slow, the hardware cannot prove its value. What NVIDIA is doing attacks that loop directly. It is saying, let us bring massive accelerated compute closer to the quantum hardware. Will that solve every problem? No. Will it solve one of the most important ones? Very possibly. Better control leads to better experiments. Better experiments lead to better error correction. Better error correction leads to more stable operations. More stable logical operations lead to more useful applications. And useful applications are what finally pull the technology into the world. That is why I keep coming back to the title. NVIDIA just connected quantum chips to GPUs. If that connection becomes real at scale, then quantum stops being a lonely island. It becomes part of the computing mainland. And once that happens, capital flows differently. Research priorities shift, software tools mature, governments pay closer attention. Entire strategies get rewritten, not because quantum suddenly does everything, but because the path to making it useful becomes less broken. That is enough to change a lot. So what should you watch next? Watch for more demonstrations that show real-time feedback between QPUs and GPUs under actual workload conditions. Watch for error correction results that depend on accelerated classical decoding. Watch for CUDA-Q adoption across more hardware makers. And watch whether NVIDIA can turn this from an elite research tool into a broader ecosystem standard. Because standards are where empires hide. The public usually falls in love with the visible device. The real winners often own the invisible layer that everything depends on. And that is exactly what may be forming here. Before we land this plane, here is one last favor. If you want more clear, high-signal breakdowns, tap like and subscribe for the next deep dive. Share this with your smartest group chat so they can say they saw the quantum GPU era coming before everyone else did. Let's end with the bigger picture. For decades, the dream of quantum computing has been trapped between wonder and disappointment. Too powerful to ignore, too difficult to trust, too important to abandon, too fragile to scale easily. NVIDIA did not solve all of that, but it may have done something just as important. It may have helped turn quantum from a miracle machine fantasy into a practical systems problem that the world knows how to attack. That is a profound shift. Because once a problem becomes a systems problem, it becomes something engineers and ecosystems can work on together. It stops being only a moonshot and starts becoming a roadmap. And roadmaps change industries. Maybe the future will not belong to quantum computers alone. Maybe it will belong to hybrid machines where processors explore nature together. Where GPUs handle the parallel work, CPUs orchestrate the rest, and AI helps the whole stack adapt in real time. If that is where we are going, then this moment matters a lot more than most people realize. Because this is not just about connecting one chip to another. It is about connecting two eras. The AI era built the accelerated foundation. The quantum era has been waiting for a way to plug into something real and fast. NVIDIA just stepped into that gap and said, we can be the bridge. And history rewards the company that builds the bridge first. So no, nothing changes in your daily life tonight. Your phone will not become quantum. Your laptop will not bend physics tomorrow. But at the level where the future is actually assembled, something important just happened. A boundary moved. A missing link got clearer. And one of the most powerful companies in the world just made it a lot easier to imagine a fused computing future. That is why this matters. That is why this is bigger than a headline. And that is why, years from now, we may look back at this moment and realize the real story was that the future started feeling inevitable.